Unfortunately, one of the biggest myths in habitat improvement is that you have to have deep pockets and a tremendous amount of acreage to make a difference. That's not true. You can get, as a matter of fact, sure, it helps having huge acres and deep pockets. I mean, man, please, feel free to give me both. But actually, the reality is doing these things is far more important on that 20 acres than it is on that 2,000 or 200 acre piece. Why? Because that person that's hunting the 20 acres, much smaller margin for error. On the bigger grounds, oh heck, I could try to mess them up and I'm going to have a real tough time doing it. Small grounds, oh, you can mess those up real easy. So, how do you get deer to spend a disproportionate amount of time on your ground? You give them everything they want better than they can get everywhere else. Now, spending a disproportionate amount of time on your ground does not mean they'll never leave. Of course they will. What I'm talking about is if they were spending 10% of their life before on your ground, getting them to spend 80%. Okay. Still spending 20% somewhere else, but that is a huge win. Heck, getting them from 20 to 30 or 40% is a big win if that increased activity happens to be during daylight. How do you do that? What do deer want and need? They want and need food, water, cover, protection from the elements, comfort, illusion of safety, breeding opportunities. You give them all that better than they can get anywhere else, they're going to spend a disproportionate amount of time on your ground. How do you give it to them better than everybody else? By offering them things that they can't get other places. And that's what all this was a setup for that. Fruit and nut trees. Look at what the neighbors have, what they don't. Offer what they don't have. Oftentimes it is fruit and nut trees. But in order to get fruit and nut trees to work for us, you know what? I can't speak for any of you. I am not a nursery expert. By any stretch of the imagination. Also, my soils, my conditions aren't ideal. Then toss in on top of it, virtually everywhere I'm doing these things, it's a remote location. I don't live there. These are all challenges that make it far more difficult for us to grow fruit trees and nut trees. So let's talk about a few things real quick that you can do to help reverse those odds. Right off the bat, every tree a nursery sells comes with a growth zones. They're good from zone 4 to zone 7. Okay, what that's saying is that this is the range that these trees potentially can grow in. Okay, jump onto USDA's website and you will find a plant zone map. All you got to do is find your location in one of those states where you're going to plant them, and it will tell you the growth zone. Those growth zones that are stated on those individual trees are the areas they can potentially grow. Trees are not going to grow anywhere near as well on the extremes. So right off the bat, if this tree is offering me something that I can't get anywhere else, what I'll do is I'll shave a half a zone. Make it so that zone 4A, the northernmost extreme, that's off the table. Zone 7B, the southernmost extreme, is off the table because trees are not going to generally grow well in the extremes. Okay, if it happens to be a tree that, you know what, there are other options available that will provide exactly the same benefits that this tree here will be, I straight shave it down a full zone. I would make it zone 5 and 6 these trees are plantable in, not zone 4 through 7. Okay, so if it has an advantage, I cut it down a half a zone. If it does not have an advantage, I trim it down a full zone and make sure the trees that I'm planting are suited for this zone. Next, the things that it goes ahead and tells you on the advertising. It can produce up to this many pounds of apples or nuts or whatever, this many feet of growth in X number of years. When you hear terms like up to, potential, can, none of those are promises. Those are the max that this tree is potentially able to achieve. Okay, that means in perfect growing conditions, in the sweet spot for those growing zones, with a perfect tree, everything working in our favor. Okay, so by cutting it down a half to a full zone, you get a little closer. And then remember, we're not planting in perfect soil, perfect sunlight, perfect water. Most of us aren't out there watering our trees every day it doesn't rain. Okay, that means we're not going to get that level of growth. Okay, keep that in mind. You'll be a little bit less disappointed in life in general when it comes to trees. You aren't going to hit those maxes. Make sure you use weed maps. That's just a map that you set down on the ground that makes it so weeds can't grow through it. By using weed mats, you cut down the competition, okay, and retain a little bit more water. Next, use those grow tubes. Those grow tubes end up going ahead and collecting moisture inside. They help create mini little rainforests. They really aren't that powerful, but they help create them. Okay, that helps us. Make sure you're planting it in areas where you will get adequate sunlight, and make sure match the soil types to the soil type these trees thrive in. Okay. Next, stagger rows whenever you're planting so they can get more sunlight, and pray for rain. There are some tricks you can use. You can go ahead and incorporate a little bit of peat moss in with the dirt when you plant. The key is that the peat moss helps retain a lot of moisture. You can use some chemical additives that help retain moisture. Just don't go too nuts, because the peat moss, some plants go ahead and rot their roots. Okay, you can go ahead and take a 5-gallon bucket full of water and drill just an 1/8 inch, 16th inch hole in it. Set it next to that planting so it dribbles water out. Be creative. There's all sorts of different things you can do that help. But it all starts with selecting the appropriate tree for your zone, for your growing conditions. You do that, and at least you're starting at the start line instead of being penalized and starting 300 yards back for the race. I can't speak for any of you, but I am not a fruit and nut tree expert. I'm not a horticulturist. I'm not a forester. What I am is a habitat manager. I do not plant trees in ideal conditions. Those trees are awesome because they allow us to offer things that the neighbors don't, getting deer to potentially spend more time on our grounds. But I don't have the time and energy that somebody running a nursery has to put into this. So the things I do to stack the odds, I make sure the trees that I'm purchasing are squarely within their growth zone where I'm going to plant. I make sure they are matched for the soil types and the amount of sunlight this location is going to get. I make darn sure that I use weed mats. I also use growth tubes, and then I fence every stinking one of these things when it comes to the fruit and nut trees, because I don't want those tubes or those trees to be rubbed until they are so darn much bigger that they can handle it, and even then I'm going to leave that fencing around those trees pretty much for the rest of their life. I'm also going to keep pruning to a minimum. The reason that I'm going to keep pruning to a minimum in this case is I want those branches up. By having those branches up, you know what? Less deer damage. You do things like that, you can stack the odds of our trees actually surviving. And you know what? It sure is a lot happier ending when you plant 50 trees and 2 years from now, 40 of them are still alive. Keep in mind, you're going to have some loss. That's okay. Having a complete loss isn't.